Hi folks. Now, whilst Jamie and Claire are forging a new life for themselves in the North American colonies, did you ever wonder what had happened to Prince Charles Edward Stuart, i.e. aka born in Prince Charlie? Of course there was his romantic escape from Scotland, brought about by the courage and determination of Flora MacDonald. But that's a whole story in its own right, and if you don't mind, I'm going to leave that for another day. But to suffice to say, what did happen then was that 17 months after, 17 months after the disastrous battle at Culloden, at first light on the 19th of September 1746, Charles is picked up by a French frigate from a sea loch near Moidart, which I think is pronounced, it's a Gaelic name, and I think it's pronounced Loch Na Nuav, but I'm sure there'll be some people will put me right on that. Anyways, it's near Moidart on the west coast of Scotland, and if you've ever driven from Fort William to Mallaig along what's called the Road to the Isles, then you would have passed very close to the place where Prince Charles boarded the French frigate, and he was then taken to France. So he left behind him most of his loyal Highlanders, but took with him some of the clan chiefs. One of his most loyal followers, John MacDonald of Borrowdale, who was left behind, said, and who had been with him throughout the long ordeal, said of this day, and so he left us, and he left us all in a worse state than he found us, which was a pretty damning indictment, I think. However, Charles arrived in France, and France, for political reasons, decided to give him a hero's welcome, and he arrived at the court at Versailles lavishly dressed in a rose-coloured velvet suit with a gold brocade, a waistcoat, and with diamond-encrusted buckles on his shoes. Charles, however, was a broken man, and he had started drinking very heavily. Prior to leaving Scotland, he had made a vow to stay chaste until he regained the crowns of Scotland and England, but he soon broke this vow, and he had an affair with his first cousin, Louisa, the Duchess of Montbazon, who was the wife of one of his closest and most loyal friends, who had served him faithfully. Louise's father, the Duke of Bouillon, was one of Charles's most strongest supporters in the French court, but he was enraged at this affair and demanded that Charles put an end to it. But by then, of course, Louise was pregnant. Charles, however, decided to dispense with her, and he left the distraught mother showing no interest in the son that she bore him, and this was his only son ever born to him, and the poor son tragically died 6 months later. But even before the baby was born, Charles had started another affair with a married woman, the Princess of Talmont. So, Charles's grandiose lifestyle at the French court, however, came to a crashing halt only 18 months later, in 1748, when the French decided, oh, actually, we're going to be friends now with Great Britain. And they signed a treaty that recognised King George as the rightful and legal ruler of Great Britain, and agreed that they would expel Charles. Charles, on hearing this, furiously refused to go. So King Louis XV sent armed soldiers, who seized him, bound him up with tapes, and took him to the border to expel him from France. So began for Charles really a life of wandering around the continent of Europe, wherever he could stay. And all the time he was drinking more and more. He never forgave King Louis or the French people, regrettably, for supposedly deserting him. Also, ever since his return to France, mostly because of his drinking, Charles had become alienated from his father, who was still alive at that time, living in Rome. He used the title King James VIII and was known as the Old Pretender. But Charles, totally alienated himself from his father. So he was losing friends and losing influence fast. He secretly visited London in 1750 in the vain hope of gathering support there that would maybe somehow or other, allow him to take over the crowns again. And in the vain hope it would give him more support, he renounced his Catholic faith and became a Protestant. All that happened by doing so was that he alienated the Pope, who may well have been one of his last few friends. He lost credibility on both sides, and he had to beat a very hasty retreat back to the continent once the British authorities became aware of his presence in the country. So back on the continent, a couple of years later in 1752, Charles asked one of his most loyal friends, Clementina Walkinshaw, to come and live with him in Ghent, which nowadays in Belgium, but was then part of the Netherlands. Clementina loved Charles and had nursed him during the 45 rebellion, when he had stayed at her uncle's house at Bannockburn, which many of you know is near Stirling. So she came to Ghent and she stayed with him for 8 years, and she bore him a beautiful daughter who was named Charlotte. But Charles, despite Clementina's obvious love for him and the daughter she had bore him, refused to marry her because she was not of aristocratic blood. He treated her terribly, often beating her and accusing her of having lovers and things like that, which she never had. Clementina, after the 8 years, finally left Charles, and she took Charlotte with her, which was a huge loss to Charles. He was by now a drunkard with this smouldering rage inside him, and he one by one rejected and cast aside all his old friends, many of them who had given up everything for him. So he was left pretty friendless. In 1766, Charles's father, James VIII, finally passed away, and Charles sadly, was told his father was ailing, refused to go and see him, which I thought was a great shame. Charles then settled in Rome, and that's really where he lived for the rest of his life, in the house where his father had lived and where he had been born himself. He was then aged 52, and he was a wreck of a man. He then decided to marry the 19-year-old Princess Louise of Stolberg, presumably hoping this would help him. But the marriage did not last long and ended when Princess Louise left him for another man. Finally, however, in 1784, 2 years later, Charles sent for his daughter Charlotte, and he legitimised her, and he made her Duchess of Albany. And Charlotte, very kindly, I think, stayed and looked after him in his final years with great care. So in 1788, at the age of 67, Charles suffered a stroke and died in Charlotte's arms. For a man who had promised so much, for whom so many had laid down their lives, there were very few who mourned his passing. And I think that's a very sad epitaph for any man to have. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this small historical insight and found it enjoyable too. If you have, maybe you could please give me a like and share it with your friends. As always, during these extremely difficult times we find ourselves living in, please keep yourself safe, and until we meet again, I wish you all the best from Scotland.